Elizabeth Carter did not cry when Nathaniel Whitmore looked through her like she was made of air. She had learned long ago that women like her were not meant to be seen. She pressed her hands flat against her faded blue skirt, lifted her chin, and walked into that grand dining room the same way she had walked through every hard year of her life. Quietly, steadily, without asking permission. She did not know that the most powerful man in Virginia was about to notice the one thing everyone else had missed. If this story already has you gripping your seat, you are exactly who I made it for. Subscribe to this channel, follow Elizabeth's story all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1815 arrived in Piedmont County, Virginia, like it always did, heavy and golden, and smelling of cut grass and burnt ambition. The Whitmore estate sat at the crest of the longest hill in the county, its white columns visible from 3 miles in every direction. People liked to say you could measure a man's importance by how far his house could be seen. If that was true, Nathaniel Whitmore was the most important man in Virginia. He did not disagree with them. At 34, Nathaniel had inherited more land than he could walk in a day, more money than he could spend in a lifetime, and more opinions about his future than he had ever asked for. His father had left him the estate at 22. His mother had left him a list of approved marriage candidates at 25. His Aunt Margaret had thrown that list into the fireplace and replaced it with something he still hadn't figured out: dinner parties. Every summer, Margaret Whitmore organized a series of formal dinner gatherings at the estate. 14 guests, 7 courses, 1 long mahogany table that his great-grandfather had hauled up from Richmond on the back of 3 wagons. And every single summer without fail, his Aunt Margaret placed the same woman beside him. Elizabeth Carter. Nobody knew quite why. The woman had no fortune, no family name worth speaking of in Piedmont County. She was a household manager, a glorified housekeeper, some said, employed by the Hargrove family on the east side of the county. She wore the same rotation of 3 dresses, each of them simple, each of them clean, each of them quietly announcing that she had not been born into the world these dinner guests occupied. The first time Margaret had done it 2 summers ago, Nathaniel had assumed it was a mistake. He'd leaned toward his aunt before the first course was served and said low and controlled, "I believe there's been an error with the seating." Margaret had looked at him over the rim of her wine glass and said, "There hasn't." He'd waited. She'd offered nothing more. The second time last summer, he hadn't bothered asking about an error. He'd simply looked at his aunt across the table with an expression that said everything he wasn't saying out loud, and she had looked back at him with a smile that communicated absolutely nothing useful. Now, it was the 3rd summer, and Elizabeth Carter was beside him again. Nathaniel stood in the doorway of the dining room for exactly 3 seconds longer than was appropriate for a man of his standing. The room was full. The Alderton daughters sat to the left, both in pale green silk that caught the candlelight. Clara Pembroke was at the far end, recently returned from a year in Boston, wearing something that cost more than most men in the county earned in a month. Thomas Hale sat beside her, watching Nathaniel with the particular expression of a man who wanted something and was deciding how to ask for it. 14 people, fine clothes, careful smiles, and Elizabeth Carter at his right hand in a blue dress that had been let out and taken in and let out again so many times that the seams had developed a kind of character. She was looking at the table, not nervously, not apologetically, just quietly, like a woman who had learned that looking at the table was safer than looking at the people around it. Nathaniel crossed the room, pulled out his chair, and sat down. "Miss Carter," he said. She looked up. Her eyes were dark and steady, and did not scramble around his face looking for something to latch onto the way most people's did. "Mr. Whitmore," she said. 2 words, perfectly even. Not warm, not cold, just accurate. He picked up his napkin. She looked back at the table. Across from them, Margaret lifted her wine glass half an inch in what Nathaniel recognized as her version of a toast. He did not return it. The first course came out cold cucumber soup with a sprig of mint, and the room filled with the particular noise of wealthy people performing conversation. The Alderton daughters talked about the new fabric their mother had ordered from Philadelphia. Thomas Hale asked Nathaniel about the Northfield acquisition, and Nathaniel gave him a short answer that was technically polite and practically a door closing in his face. He was aware, in the way you are aware of a fire in a room, even when you are not looking at it, that Elizabeth Carter was eating her soup in perfect silence beside him. Not uncomfortable silence. Not the silence of someone trying very hard not to speak. Just quiet. The way a person is quiet when they don't feel the need to fill the air with words to prove they belong somewhere. It bothered him. He couldn't say exactly why. "You're the Hargroves' household manager," he said. It came out more flatly than he intended, a statement rather than a question, which was rude. He knew that. She looked at him without blinking. "I am." "How long?" 4 years. He nodded as if this was useful information. It wasn't. He'd known exactly how long she'd worked for the Hargroves. Piedmont County was not a large place. "And before that," he asked. Something shifted in her face. Not much. Just a small, careful adjustment, the kind a person makes when they're deciding how honest to be. "Before that, I managed the household finances for my father's business," she said. "After he died, I found other employment." "What kind of business?" "Grain trading. He built it from nothing." She set her spoon down with a precision that was almost architectural. "It was a good business. The men who bought it after his death ran it into the ground within 18 months. There was no bitterness in her voice, just the clean, direct quality of someone stating a fact about a fire that happened a long time ago. Nathaniel found himself wanting to ask more. He didn't. He picked up his spoon instead. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said. "It was 6 years ago," she said. "But thank you." He looked at her sideways. She was looking at the table again. No performance, no attempt to make him feel guilty or sympathetic or indebted, just acknowledgement and then release. He had been in rooms full of people for most of his adult life. He could not immediately think of another person who had spoken to him that way. The second course was brought out, and with it came Clara Pembroke's voice from the far end of the table, pitched carefully to Carrie. "I simply cannot imagine managing a household without proper training," Clara said. She was speaking to the woman beside her, but her eyes swept the table in the way of a person who wants their audience to be broad. "There's a particular kind of woman suited for domestic service, and it does require a very specific sort of temperament." The pause before the word temperament lasted about half a second too long. Nathaniel watched Elizabeth Carter's jaw tighten just slightly, and then release. She did not look at Clara Pembroke. She reached for her water glass, took a careful sip, and set it back down. Thomas Hale chuckled. One of the Alderton daughters covered a smile. The man beside Clara Frederick Dunmore, who'd inherited his father's tobacco business and nothing else of value, said something low into Clara's ear that made her smile widen. Nathaniel's hand resting on the table closed slowly into a fist. He hadn't planned to say anything. "Managing a household of the Hargrove scale," he said conversationally, cutting into his roasted hen, "requires significantly more than domestic temperament, Miss Pembroke. It requires financial literacy, personnel management, and the ability to make decisions quickly and correctly under pressure." The table got slightly quieter. "I wouldn't know," Clara said with the particular lightness of a woman who had never been required to know anything. "No," Nathaniel said. "I imagine not." He went back to eating. Beside him, he heard Elizabeth Carter draw a slow, quiet breath. He did not look at her. He didn't need to. After the third course, the conversation at the table fractured into smaller pieces, and Nathaniel found himself drawn back into the orbit of the woman beside him with a persistence that was starting to irritate him. Not because she was demanding his attention. That was precisely the problem. She wasn't. While the Alderton daughters made sure their laughter traveled across the table toward him. While Clara Pembroke asked him questions that were really invitations to compliment her. While Thomas Hale circled back to the North Field 3 separate times. Elizabeth Carter ate her supper, responded when spoken to, and did not once aim herself at him like a cannon. "You haven't asked me about the North Field," he said during a lull in the table's noise. She looked at him with an expression that was almost amused. "Why would I ask you about a field? Everybody else has." "I'm not everybody else," she said simply. He studied her face. "Don't you want to know what I'm doing with it?" "Not particularly." She smoothed the edge of her napkin on her lap. "It's your land, Mr. Whitmore. What you do with it is your business." "Most people see my business as their business. Most people want something from you," she said, and there was not 1 ounce of cruelty in it, just the flat level quality of a woman saying a true thing. "I don't." He stared at her. "That's—" He stopped. Started again. "That's either very honest or very strategic." She met his eyes without flinching. "It's honest. I have found that honesty requires less memory than strategy." He looked at her for a long moment. Long enough that it was slightly past the duration social grace allowed. "Your father taught you that?" he asked. "My father taught me to keep clean books," she said. "That particular lesson I learned on my own." For the first time in what felt like a very long time, Nathaniel Whitmore smiled. Not the polished, managed version he kept ready for dinner parties. A real one. The kind that moved more of his face than he intended. Elizabeth Carter noticed. Something in her expression shifted. Not softening exactly, more like a door that had been closed moving a half-inch on its hinges. Then she looked back at her plate, and the door was still again. Across the table, Margaret was watching. She had been watching all evening with the patient focus of a woman who had spent 62 years learning to see what other people couldn't be bothered to notice. She had watched Nathaniel deflect Clara Pembroke's questions. She had watched him cut off Thomas Hale's third attempt to discuss land acquisition. She had watched him defend Elizabeth Carter's profession to a table full of people who thought that kind of work was beneath comment. She had watched him smile. Margaret lifted her wine glass to her lips and took a sip. She'd been placing Elizabeth Carter beside her nephew for 3 summers now. The first year he'd been merely annoyed. The second, he'd been curious in spite of himself. This year he was paying attention. Not the way a man pays attention to a woman he wants to impress. The way a man pays attention to something he cannot yet explain. That was the year that mattered. Margaret set her glass down and turned to the woman on her left to make conversation about a garden, and smiled to herself where nobody could see it. The dinner concluded with dessert, a syllabub that nobody finished, and a port that everybody pretended to like, and then the guests moved toward the front parlor in the slow drift that signals the end of a formal evening. Nathaniel was stopped 3 times between the dining room and the front door by people who wanted 2 more minutes of his attention. He gave each of them slightly less than they asked for, and kept moving. He was almost at the door when he heard it. Frederick Dunmore's voice coming from near the coat rack. Low enough to be private. Not quite low enough. "I never understood why Margaret keeps inviting the help to these things," Dunmore said. A woman's laugh, quiet and mean. "She's not quite the help," another voice said, one of the Alderton girls, Nathaniel thought. "She's somewhere between. Which is almost worse, isn't it? She doesn't quite fit anywhere." Nathaniel stopped walking. He turned his head enough to see the small cluster near the coat rack Dunmore. Catherine Alderton and the woman beside Dunmore, whose name he hadn't bothered to learn. None of them had noticed him. "Did you see her dress?" Dunmore said. "I counted at least 2 different patches near the hem." "She was pleasant enough," Catherine Alderton said with the particular graciousness of someone who wants credit for faint praise. "For what she is." "Which is what exactly?" Dunmore asked. "Decorative poverty," the unnamed woman said, and they all laughed. Nathaniel stood very still. He was a man who had been raised to control himself in social situations, to manage his reactions, to choose the correct response with the deliberation of a man who understood that his words carried weight. He turned around completely. "Dunmore," he said. The laughter stopped. Frederick Dunmore turned, and the color that left his face when he saw Nathaniel's expression was the kind of color that doesn't come back quickly. "Whitmore," he said, carefully. Nathaniel walked toward them at an even pace. He stopped 3 feet from Dunmore, which was close enough to be a message. "I believe," Nathaniel said quietly with absolute precision, "that you were discussing a guest in my home." Dunmore opened his mouth. "A guest," Nathaniel said, "who was invited by my family, who sat at my table, who ate my food." He looked at each of them in turn, slow, deliberate. "If any of you find the company in this house unsuitable, I want you to know that my door is always open." He let that sit for exactly 3 seconds. "In the outward direction," he added. He turned and walked back toward the front door. His hands at his sides were not entirely steady. Elizabeth Carter was standing just outside the front door at the edge of the porch, looking out at the dark line of the tree wall across the drive. She heard his footsteps on the porch behind her and turned slightly and then turned back. "You didn't have to do that," she said. He stopped beside her. The night air was still warm, the way Virginia summer nights stay warm, long past the point of comfort. "You heard?" he said. "I hear most things," she said. "I've had a great deal of practice being the person in the room that people forget to speak quietly around." He looked at the side of her face, the set of her jaw, the way she held her spine straight without appearing to hold it straight. "It was wrong," he said. "What they said." "It was honest," she replied with a slight edge of something that wasn't quite bitterness and wasn't quite humor. "They meant every word. That's more than most people offer. You're defending them." "I'm describing them," she said. "There's a difference." He was quiet for a moment. A moth circled the lamp beside the door. "Your dress," he said, and then stopped because he realized halfway through the sentence that there was no graceful way to end it. She looked at him directly. In the lamplight, her eyes were very clear. "Has been altered several times," she said. "Yes, I'm aware. I wasn't—" He stopped again. He was not accustomed to sentences that didn't know where they were going. "I wasn't making a comment about the dress." "I know," she said. "You were making a comment about the people who made a comment about it." She turned back to look at the drive. "You don't need to make that comment on my behalf, Mr. Whitmore. I have survived Frederick Dunmore's opinions before tonight." "That doesn't mean you should have to." She looked at him again, and something in her face changed. Not the small, half-inch shift from before. Something more. "No," she said quietly. "It doesn't." She didn't say thank you. He found standing there in the warm summer dark that he didn't need her to. Margaret appeared in the doorway behind them, pulling on her gloves with the unhurried efficiency of a woman who had somewhere to be and had chosen to take her time getting there. "Elizabeth," she said warmly, "Silas will bring the wagon around for you in a moment. Thank you for coming this evening." "Thank you for the invitation," Elizabeth said with a warmth directed at Margaret that Nathaniel hadn't heard her direct at anyone else all evening. "The food was exceptional." "Everything here is exceptional," Margaret said with a glance at Nathaniel that lasted slightly too long to be accidental. "Some things just take longer to recognize." Elizabeth said her goodnights, descended the porch steps, and walked toward the drive without looking back. Nathaniel watched her go. Margaret settled beside him with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had set something in motion a long time ago and was beginning to see the first results. "3 summers," Nathaniel said. Margaret said. "3 summers you've placed her beside me." "I have." "Why?" Margaret considered the question with the deliberate care she applied to all his questions, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she wanted to give him time to almost find it himself first. "Because she is the most interesting person in the county," she said finally. "She's a household manager. She ran a grain trading business's finances from the age of 19 after her mother died." Margaret said pleasantly. "Managed the estate accounts for the Hargroves for 4 years. Speaks frankly, keeps every promise she makes, and has never once in my presence said a single word she didn't mean." Nathaniel was quiet. "She is also," Margaret continued, "the only person who comes to these dinners who has never asked me a single question about your inheritance." The drive was empty now. Elizabeth Carter and the wagon had gone. Nathaniel stood looking at the space where she'd been. "That's not a reason to keep placing her at my table," he said. "Isn't it?" Margaret said. She went back inside. Nathaniel stood on the porch for a while longer in the summer dark, his hand on the railing, looking at nothing. 3 weeks passed. Nathaniel told himself he was busy. The Northfield acquisition required contracts. The East Barn needed new timber. 3 of his tenant farmers had questions about the autumn planting schedules, and he spent the better part of 2 days writing the property lines with his foreman, a quiet, capable man named Thomas Reach, who had been with the estate since Nathaniel's father's time. He did not think about Elizabeth Carter. He thought about her 4 separate times on Tuesday alone. The first time was when he was reviewing accounts and noticed an error that had been carried forward through 3 months of ledgers, not a catastrophic error, but the kind of careful, quiet, invisible mistake that accumulates into a problem. He thought about what she'd said. "My father taught me to keep clean books." He thought about what it meant to learn that lesson young in the middle of grief. The second time was at breakfast, when his housekeeper, Mrs. Aldrich, mentioned offhandedly that the Hargrove estate had hosted a successful harvest dinner, and everyone had commented on the quality of the management. He did not ask which manager specifically. He already knew. The third time was during the contract review for the Northfield, when his solicitor said something pompous about the importance of maintaining one's position in society. And Nathaniel thought about a woman in a blue dress who had said, "I'm not everybody else." The fourth time he was standing at his bedroom window in the late evening, watching the sky go from orange to dark, and he wasn't thinking about anything specific at all. That was the one that bothered him most. Geshud. The second dinner was 3 weeks after the first. He told himself he noticed nothing different. He sat down. He put his napkin in his lap. He looked to his right automatically, the way you look for something you have become accustomed to finding in a particular place. Elizabeth Carter was not there. He looked at the chair beside him, empty, set with silver and crystal, waiting for a guest who had not arrived. He looked across the table at Margaret. She looked back at him with an expression that communicated sympathy in a way that he found deeply suspicious. "Miss Carter sends her apologies," Margaret said. "One of the Hargrove children is unwell. She remained at the estate." "Ah," Nathaniel said. He looked back at his empty wineglass. A footman filled it. Thomas Hale was placed beside him instead, and within 10 minutes had brought up the Northfield, twice the cotton market once, and complimented Nathaniel's coat in a way that was somehow also about the Northfield. Nathaniel ate his supper. He was aware with a precision that he found mildly alarming that supper was duller than it had been 3 weeks ago. He did not examine this observation closely. He rode past the Hargrove estate on a Thursday. He told himself he was checking on the condition of the Eastern Road, which was true, and also that the Eastern Road happened to run alongside the Hargrove property, which was also true. He did not tell himself what he was looking for. He saw her through the gate crossing the yard between the main house and the kitchen outbuilding, carrying a ledger, and talking to a man he recognized as the Hargrove's head groundskeeper. She was pointing at something in the ledger with one finger, and the groundskeeper was nodding with the rapid agreement of a man who understood that the woman making the point was correct. She did not see Nathaniel. He rode on. That evening, he wrote 2 letters, reviewed the barn contracts, and went to bed at a reasonable hour. He lay awake for quite some time. The third dinner of the summer came in the last week of July. He arrived in the dining room 4 minutes early, which he never did. He told himself this was because he had finished his other business ahead of schedule. Elizabeth Carter was already seated. She looked up when he came in with the same level, direct quality as the first time and said, "Mr. Whitmore," with the same 2-word precision as before. "Miss Carter," he said, and sat down. The footmen filled their glasses. Around them, other guests were beginning to arrive, and the room started to fill with the particular noise of an evening assembling itself. "The Hargrove child," he said, "recovered." She looked at him, and something registered in her eyes, small and quick like a bird landing, and immediately lifting off. "Fully," she said. "Thank you for asking. I heard you stayed with the family." The youngest tends to be frightened when he's ill. His parents were in Richmond. She looked down at her napkin. Someone should be there? He thought about that. About a woman choosing to sit beside a sick child rather than attend a dinner party with the richest man in the county. Mrs. Aldrich mentioned the Hargrove dinner was well received, he said. Mrs. Aldrich is kind. Mrs. Aldrich is accurate, he said. She doesn't offer compliments she doesn't mean. Elizabeth looked at him again, and this time the something in her eyes stayed a little longer. "No," she said. "I don't suppose she does." By the time the fourth course arrived, they had talked about grain storage methods, the particular challenges of managing household staff through a Virginia summer, the difference between a well-structured account ledger and one that only appears well-structured, and whether the county surveyor's assessment of the Eastern Road was trustworthy. It was not the conversation Nathaniel Whitmore usually had at dinner parties. He found he could not have said what time it was. He found he had eaten more of his supper than he usually did, and noticed the food less. He found that Thomas Hale, seated across from him, had been trying to catch his eye for the past half hour, and had not managed it. "You disagree with me," he said at a certain point during the sixth course, not accusatorially, but with the slight surprise of a man who didn't encounter it often. "About the Eastern Road survey, yes," Elizabeth said. "The surveyor measures the width. He doesn't measure the weight of what travels it. Those are different problems." "You've spent time on that road." "Every week on the way to the county market." She turned her wine glass by the stem, a slow, deliberate motion. "A road can be the right width and still ruin an axle. Width is the wrong measurement." Nathaniel looked at her. "What's the right measurement?" he asked. "How much it costs the person who has no other road to take," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Around them, the table continued its noise silver on china laughter, the soft insistence of people's social performances. "That's not how surveyors are trained to think," he said. "No," she agreed. "It's how people with no money learn to think." She said it without self-pity, without invitation for his sympathy. She said it the way she said most things, as though it were simply a fact about the world, as relevant as weather. Nathaniel looked at his wine glass. He had built most of his understanding of Piedmont County from the top of that hill, from the crest where his house stood visible for 3 miles. The thought landed in him with the particular weight of something true. The evening ended differently this time. As the guests moved toward the parlor, Nathaniel found himself walking at the same pace as Elizabeth Carter, without having decided to, and they came to a brief stop near the doorway, where the room narrowed. "You'll come to the August dinner?" he asked. She looked at him. The question was more direct than the ones he'd been asking all evening, and they both knew it. "If I'm invited," she said. "You're always invited." "By your aunt," she said with a precision that was almost gentle. He held her gaze. "By this house," he said. It was a small distinction. He wasn't entirely certain he'd meant to make it. Something moved across her face, not quite the door this time. Something slower, a kind of careful recognition, the way a person looks at something they've been warned not to trust. "Then I'll come," she said. She moved into the parlor. He stood in the doorway for a moment in the residual warmth of the conversation, and then followed. Margaret appeared at his elbow an hour later, when most of the guests had gone. "You're different this evening," she said. "I'm the same as I always am," Nathaniel said. Margaret said in the way that meant she knew exactly how wrong he was, and was choosing not to argue about it. She accepted a glass of port from a passing footman, and held it without drinking. "She's a remarkable woman." "She's direct," he said. "That's part of it. She doesn't want anything from me. That's another part of it." Margaret turned her glass. "There's more," Nathaniel said nothing. "She sees you, Nathaniel," Margaret said quietly. "Not the estate, not the inheritance, not the position." She looked at him with the particular directness of a woman who had earned the right to say hard things. "You. The man who is sometimes lonely and sometimes proud and sometimes quite unsure of what he is underneath all of this." The parlor was mostly empty now. A fire in the grate, 2 guests in a far corner making their good nights. "You've been placing her beside me for 3 summers," he said. "I have." "You did it deliberately." "I did." He turned to look at his aunt, 62 years old, sharp as a winter morning, the person who had known him longest of anyone living. "What were you trying to do?" he asked. Margaret took a small sip of her port and set it down. "I was trying to show you the difference," she said, "between someone who sees your name and someone who sees your face." The fire made quiet sounds in the grate. Nathaniel looked at it for a long time. "That woman," he said finally, "keeps a better account ledger than most men I've hired." Margaret smiled. It was small and certain and entirely knowing. "Yes," she said. "She does." He could not have said afterward what shifted in him that summer night. Only that when he rode home from the estate the following morning, having stayed late as he sometimes did, walking the property in the early dawn, he passed the eastern road. He stopped his horse. He looked at the road. Not its width, its surface, its condition, the places where the gravel had worn thin under the pressure of regular traffic, the ruts at the edges where the weight of loaded wagons had carved themselves into the earth. He thought about what it cost the person who had no other road to take. He sat on his horse in the early morning light for a long time. Then he turned around, rode back to the estate, and found his estate manager. "I want a full assessment of the eastern road," he said. "Not width, load tolerance. What the surface will bear over time and what it costs when it fails." His estate manager blinked. "That's not how—" "I know," Nathaniel said. "Do it anyway." He handed over his horse and went inside. In his study, the account ledgers were stacked where he'd left them. He sat down, opened the most recent one, and looked at the error he'd found 3 weeks ago, the quiet mistake that had accumulated unseen through 3 months of records. He corrected it, carefully, thoroughly, page by page back to where it had started. It took him most of the morning. When he finished, the books were clean. He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling and thought about nothing in particular for a while. Then he thought about August. The August dinner came on a Thursday, and Nathaniel Whitmore had not told a single person how many times he had looked at the calendar that week. He had reviewed contracts. He had ridden the property. He had sat through 2 separate meetings with his solicitor about the North Field and paid adequate attention to approximately half of what was said. He had corrected 3 more ledger errors that he probably would not have caught a month ago before a woman in a faded blue dress told him that width was the wrong measurement. He had not thought about Elizabeth Carter. He had thought about her every single day. He told himself this was because she was an interesting case study, a person of unusual intelligence operating in circumstances that constrained her. The kind of mind that in different conditions would have done something significant. He told himself his interest was intellectual, observational, the detached curiosity of a man who had spent most of his adult life surrounded by people who wanted things from him and had simply encountered someone who did not. He told himself all of this with great thoroughness, and none of it was entirely wrong, and none of it was the whole truth either. She arrived at the estate 20 minutes before the other guests. He knew this because he happened to be in the front hall when the wagon came up the drive. He happened to be in the front hall because he had business with Mrs. Aldrich about the seating arrangements. He had no business with Mrs. Aldrich about the seating arrangements. He watched through the front window as Elizabeth climbed down from the Hargrove wagon with the careful efficiency of a woman who had learned to manage physical logistics without assistance. She wore the same blue dress, or a different one, he realized with something approaching embarrassment that he could not immediately tell them apart. She had something in her hands. A small paper package neatly tied. He moved away from the window before she reached the door. When Mrs. Aldrich showed her in, Nathaniel was at the far side of the hall, looking at a painting he had looked at approximately 10,000 times in his life, and was now studying with intense interest. "Mr. Whitmore," Elizabeth said. He turned. "Miss Carter, you're early." "I'm on time," she said with slight precision. "The other guests are late." He almost smiled. "That's one way to see it. It's the accurate way." She held the paper package slightly forward, not presenting it, just acknowledging it existed. "I brought something for your aunt, preserved blackberries. She mentioned at the last dinner that the estate's blackberry crop had been thin this year. The Hargroves had surplus." He looked at the package, then at her. "She mentioned that once," he said, in passing. "I listen when people speak," Elizabeth said simply. He took that in. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he was assembling a list, all the things this woman had said to him that landed differently than what other people said. "I listen when people speak." He was going to be thinking about that one for days. "I'll have someone take it to her," he said. "I'd rather give it to her myself if you don't mind." He did not mind. He called for a footman to show her to Margaret's sitting room and watched her follow the young man down the corridor with the same straight-backed, unhurried quality she brought to everything. He stood in the empty front hall for a moment. Then he went back to the study, found the Eastern Road assessment his estate manager had completed, and read it again, without absorbing a single word. The dinner assembled at 7, and Nathaniel took his seat with the careful control of a man who was doing an ordinary thing and knew it. Elizabeth was to his right. The Alderton sisters had been redistributed to the far end of the table. Clara Pembroke had declined the invitation, a diplomatic illness, Margaret had said, with an expression that communicated her precise opinion of that particular illness. Thomas Hale was there, and Frederick Dunmore, and several people Nathaniel liked well enough in small measures, and one woman, Eleanor Marsh, who had arrived from Richmond with her husband 2 weeks ago, and who Nathaniel's mother had written about from Philadelphia in terms that required him to read the letter twice to locate the actual content beneath the implication. Eleanor Marsh was 28. Her husband was 56 and in poor health. She wore sapphires at her throat and had the practiced social ease of a woman who had been raised to move through rooms full of powerful men. She was seated directly across from Nathaniel. She smiled at him when he sat down, and it was a very good smile. Warm without being forward, interested without being obvious. Elizabeth Carter said, "Good evening, Mr. Whitmore," and reached for her water glass without looking up. He said good evening to both of them. Eleanor Marsh observed this with a sharp intelligence she was very good at concealing behind pleasantness. The first course came and went, and Nathaniel was aware of a strange doubling in his own attention. Eleanor Marsh across the table deploying careful charm. Elizabeth Carter beside him, deploying nothing at all. Dunmore was talking about Richmond. Hale was talking about cotton futures. Margaret was at the head of the table listening to Eleanor Marsh's husband describe a property dispute in a way that required no contribution from Margaret, but which she managed to make interesting anyway, through the pure skill of attentiveness. "You've met Mrs. Marsh before?" Elizabeth asked. He looked at her. She was looking at her soup. "No," he said. "She knows a great deal about you," Elizabeth said. "She's asked your aunt about your estate management twice since she sat down. I was in the sitting room when your aunt returned before dinner." He was quiet for a moment. "You were listening." "I was sitting in the same room," she said. "There's a difference." "And?" She looked at him sideways, just briefly, just enough. "And she's very good at asking questions that sound like compliments." He looked across the table at Eleanor Marsh, who at that exact moment said something that made the man beside her laugh, and then glanced over at Nathaniel with the natural ease of someone who had practiced the natural ease for a very long time. "That's an uncharitable assessment," he said. "I didn't say it was a criticism," Elizabeth said. "It's a skill. She's practiced it well." She broke a piece of bread with clean, precise fingers. "I'm simply telling you what I observed." "Why?" She considered the question for a moment in the honest way she considered everything. "Because you defended me at this table," she said quietly. "Twice." and I don't have much to offer in return. But I do pay attention." The table noise continued around them. Silver, laughter, the careful performance of an evening. Nathaniel looked at his soup. "I didn't defend you to create a debt," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm telling you." Halfway through the third course, Eleanor Marsh directed a comment toward the end of the table in Nathaniel's direction. It was something about the management of large estates framed as a question about his methods, which sounded genuine and was constructed with the precision of a musician who knows exactly which note will resonate. Nathaniel gave a polite answer. She followed up with another question that sounded like admiration and was really a door. "You run everything yourself?" she asked with the soft disbelief of a woman who found this impressive and wanted him to know she found it impressive. "I have capable staff," he said. "Still," she said, "a man who understands his own operation." She turned slightly toward her husband, who was absorbed in conversation. "That's rarer than people admit." From beside him, very quietly, Elizabeth said, "It is." He turned. She was not looking at him. She was cutting her chicken with even measured strokes. But she had said it plainly, without performance, without directing it at anyone. Just "it is." He found with some surprise that he wanted to know everything she meant by that. The plain statement that contained a whole history inside it. A woman who had watched men manage money badly, manage businesses badly, manage people badly, and was simply confirming without drama that competence was rare. He looked at Eleanor Marsh across the table. She was still smiling. He looked back at his plate. The moment came between the fifth and sixth course, in the brief pause when footmen cleared and reset, and the table exhaled. Frederick Dunmore, whose capacity for reading the room had never been his strongest quality, chose this moment to speak. "I understand," he said, addressing the general table, but looking at no one specifically in the way of a man who is about to say something he has been saving, that the Hargroves are looking to reduce staff before autumn, economy measures. The table shifted slightly. One of those comments that changes the air. Elizabeth's hands on the table stilled. Nathaniel noticed. "I hadn't heard that," Thomas Hale said. "Apparently, the household manager's position is among those being reviewed," Dunmore said, with the precise lightness of a man enjoying information others don't have. "Seems they need someone with stronger social connections for the business they're doing." The table absorbed this. Some people looked at Elizabeth. Some people looked away from her. Both were their own kind of unkind. Elizabeth reached for her water glass. Her hand was steady. Her face was neutral. But Nathaniel had been paying attention to her long enough to know that neutral wasn't the same as fine. He could see it in the slight set of her jaw, the breath she took through her nose, the way she set the glass down with exactly the same care as always, except 1 degree too careful. "Dunmore," Nathaniel said. Dunmore looked at him. "Where did you hear that?" A small pause. "Well, from various sources. The county talks." "The county talks a great deal," Nathaniel said, "and is accurate roughly half the time." He picked up his own glass. "What you've described is speculation. Presenting it as fact at someone else's table is—" He turned the glass. "Careless." Dunmore's jaw tightened. "I was simply passing along." "You were passing along something that concerned a guest at this table," Nathaniel said quietly, without knowing whether it was true, and without considering whether it was kind. He set his glass down. "Both of those are problems." The table was very quiet. Eleanor Marsh was watching Nathaniel with an expression he couldn't immediately read. Margaret from the head of the table reached for her wine. Elizabeth did not look at Nathaniel. She was looking at her plate, and her hands were folded in her lap, and her face was arranged into composure, the way a person arranges something breakable into a safe position. The footman returned with the sixth course, and the table slowly, carefully found its noise again. He did not speak to her again until the meal was nearly over. Not because he didn't want to, because he could feel her needing the quiet. The same way you can feel a person needing space in a room, something in their posture, their breathing, the angle of their attention. She ate the rest of the meal. She responded when spoken to. She did not once look like she was struggling, which he now understood was a skill she had spent years perfecting. As the final dessert plates were cleared, he said low for her alone. "Is it true what Dunmore said?" She was quiet for a moment. "I don't know," she said. "You don't know if your position is under review. I know that James Hargrove mentioned 3 weeks ago that he and his wife were reviewing household expenses." She folded her napkin precisely. "I know that I have not been told anything directly. I also know that James Hargrove is a man who finds conversations about money very difficult to have with women, even when those women are the ones who have been managing his money." She set the napkin down. "So, I don't know." He looked at the side of her face. 6 years since her father died. 4 years managing a household that may be about to let her go. A woman who kept clean books and listened when people spoke and brought preserved blackberries to a woman who had once mentioned in passing that the blackberry crop was thin. "What would you do," he asked, "if they let you go?" "Find other employment," she said without hesitation. "Is that easy?" She looked at him then directly with that level quality she had, and for a moment he saw something underneath the composure. Not fear exactly, something quieter and older than fear. The particular steadiness of a person who has survived enough hard things that they no longer ask if they'll survive the next one. They just begin preparing. "No," she said. "It isn't easy. But I'm not without skills and I'm not without sense." She looked back at the table. "I've managed before." "By yourself," he said. "Yes." "Always," she paused, just briefly. "Mostly," she said. And there was something in that one word, the small, careful concession of mostly instead of always, that told him more than everything else she'd said combined. Eleanor Marsh found him in the parlor an hour later. She did it well. The approach was gradual, conversational, social. A comment about the food, a question about the portraits on the far wall, a laugh at something her husband said from across the room. And then somehow they were standing slightly apart from the others near the window, and she was saying something about Virginia Summers that was really about something else entirely. "Your aunt speaks very highly of you," she said. "My aunt is generous," he said. "She's honest," Eleanor said, which is rarer. She glanced toward the corner of the room where Margaret was talking to Hale. "She told me you've been running this estate with real care, not just as an inheritance, but as a responsibility." She looked at him. "That's admirable." "I'm not sure it's admirable," he said. "It's just accurate." "See, she smiled. "That's what I mean. Most men in your position would accept the compliment. Most men in my position don't need to be told they're doing their jobs," he said. She blinked, not offended, more recalibrating. "I've been told," she said more directly, "that you've been resistant to the idea of remarrying." "I haven't been married," he said, "so I'm not sure resistance is the correct description." "To marriage, then." She tilted her head slightly. "May I ask why?" He looked at her, the sapphires, the practiced ease, the intelligence underneath it, and thought about what Elizabeth Carter had said at the dinner table. "She's very good at asking questions that sound like compliments." "Every woman I've spoken to in a social context," he said carefully, "has been interested in what I have, not who I am." He turned his wine glass once. "I find that conversation difficult to sustain." Eleanor Marsh studied him, with an expression that was genuinely more honest than anything else she'd shown him that evening. "That's a very lonely position," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is." She looked across the room toward the corner where Elizabeth Carter was speaking to Margaret, a brief exchange, something that made Margaret reach out and touch her hand with the quiet warmth of a woman who genuinely meant it. "The woman your aunt favors," Eleanor said, not unkindly, just perceptive. He said nothing. "She's quite different," Eleanor said. "Yes," he said. I see. Eleanor Marsh took a small sip of her wine and looked at him with the clear-eyed honesty of a woman who has decided to drop a performance. Then I imagine this conversation has a natural conclusion. He looked at her with something approaching respect. You're remarkably direct for someone who spent most of dinner being indirect. I'm direct when it costs me nothing to be, she said with a slight smile. Indirect when it costs me everything. She inclined her head. I hope it works out, Mr. Whitmore, whoever she is. She moved back toward her husband with the smooth social grace of a woman who knew how to exit a room, and he watched her go and thought that under completely different circumstances he might have liked Eleanor Marsh very much. Margaret found him near the door as the last guests departed. You were watching her all evening, Margaret said. I was being attentive to my guests, Nathaniel said. You were attentive to one of them, Margaret said pleasantly. The others may as well have been furniture. He didn't argue. There wasn't a way to argue that wouldn't require him to lie, and he'd spent enough of the summer lying to himself without extending the project. Dunmore's comment, he said, about the Hargroves letting her go. I heard, Margaret said. Her voice had lost its pleasantness. It was its winter quality, now dry and clear and unsparing. Is it true? Margaret was quiet for a moment. James Hargrove, she said finally, is a man who has benefited enormously from Elizabeth's management of his household and has never once told her so. He is also a man who, when faced with financial pressure, tends to look first at the people who cannot argue back. Nathaniel felt something tighten in his chest. That's a yes. That's a description of the situation, Margaret said. The outcome is not yet determined. What is she going to do? What she always does, Margaret said quietly. Find a way. Pick herself up. Start again. She looked at him with the full weight of 62 years of watching people. The question, Nathaniel, is not what she's going to do. She has managed every hard thing that has happened to her with more grace than most men would manage with 10 times the resources. He looked at the empty parlor doorway. The room beyond was quiet now, the candles guttering. The question, Margaret said, is what you're going to do. He turned to look at his aunt. With what? She looked at him with the steady patience of a woman who had waited 3 summers for him to be ready for this conversation. With what you know, she said. About her, about yourself, about what it means to finally see someone clearly. The house had gone quiet around them. Outside, the last wagons were moving down the drive. Somewhere in the dark of the Virginia summer, Elizabeth Carter was riding back to a household that might or might not still need her in the autumn, and she had never once looked at Nathaniel Whitmore like he was a solution to anything. Which was, he understood now, precisely the problem. He was beginning to understand that he wanted to be. 2 days after the dinner, Nathaniel went to see James Hargrove. He told himself it was a business call. Hargrove had 2 fields adjacent to Nathaniel's northwest property, and there had been a conversation several years ago about easement rights. It was a legitimate reason to ride over. A man didn't need any other reason to ride over. Hargrove met him in the study with the slightly nervous energy of a man who knew his finances were being observed by the county and didn't love the scrutiny. They talked about the easement for 20 minutes. Nathaniel concluded the conversation, accepted a glass of whiskey, and was almost at the door when he stopped. Your household, he said. Running well. Hargrove looked at him with the expression of a man trying to determine whether this was small talk or something else. Well enough, he said. I heard you might be making changes before autumn. Hargrove set down his glass. Where did you hear that? Piedmont County Talks, Nathaniel said. A pause. Hargrove looked uncomfortable. The particular discomfort of a man who has made a decision he doesn't want to say out loud. There are some efficiencies we're reviewing, Hargrove said carefully. The management position, Nathaniel said. Hargrove's discomfort deepened. Among others. Nathaniel looked at him for a long moment. James, he said, I'm going to ask you something directly, and I'd like a direct answer. Hargrove waited. Is Elizabeth Carter being let go? The silence lasted 3 seconds, which was an answer. We haven't made any final decisions, Hargrove said. But you're leaning toward it. Another pause. The social connection side of the household management hosting correspondence with certain families. We feel we need someone who comes from a family with a recognizable name, Nathaniel said. Hargrove didn't deny it. Nathaniel picked up his hat from the side table. I want to tell you something, he said without anger, very evenly. Elizabeth Carter has managed your household finances for 4 years with a precision that most men I employ for twice the position cannot match. She caught an error in your quarterly grain account in her first month that would have cost you $400 compounded over the following year. He settled the hat. I know this because she mentioned it once in passing as an example of common accounting mistakes, not as something she had done for you. She wasn't advertising herself to me. She was illustrating a point about clean ledgers. Hargrove was very still. The family names in this county, Nathaniel continued, have access to my dining table regardless. What they don't all have access to is a household manager who keeps your books clean and remembers your youngest son needs someone with him when he's ill. He moved toward the door. Think carefully about what you're buying when you pay for a name versus what you're giving up when you let go of competence. He left without waiting for a response. He rode home fast in the warm August morning and was halfway across the county before he realized that his hands on the reins were shaking slightly. Not with anger. With the specific, unfamiliar, slightly terrifying feeling of a man who has done something for someone, not because it was strategic, and not because it was polite, and not because it was expected. Because he couldn't stand the alternative. He slowed the horse to a walk. Around him, Virginia stretched out in every direction. Fields and fences and sky and the long dusty roads that connected one life to another. The road he was on was the North Road, wide, well-maintained, built to serve the people who could afford to use it comfortably. Elizabeth Carter used the Eastern Road. He thought about that for a very long time. He did not tell her. He considered it in the days after the visit to Hargrove and set it aside. She had not asked for his intervention. She would not have asked for it. She was precisely the kind of person who considered the help of powerful men to be a transaction with costs she hadn't agreed to pay. He did not want her to feel indebted to him. He wanted, and this was the part that sat in his chest in a new and inconvenient way, he wanted her to simply be all right. Not because of him. Just all right. It was a new kind of wanting. He did not entirely know what to do with it. Margaret came to find him on a Friday afternoon, in the way she did when she had decided something needed to be said. James Hargrove's wife called on me this morning. She said, sitting across from him in the study with her hands in her lap and her eyes at full focus. Nathaniel looked up from his papers. She wanted to tell me, Margaret continued, that they've decided to retain Elizabeth's position. Full terms through the winter. He looked at his aunt. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. And, he said, and Catherine Hargrove seemed to feel that a conversation her husband had recently had led him to reconsider certain decisions. Margaret adjusted the cuff of her sleeve. She didn't know who he'd spoken with. She said James was unusually quiet about it. Nathaniel looked back at his papers. He said. Margaret sat with him in the quiet for a while. The clock on the mantel counted seconds. Outside, someone was crossing the yard. She would want to know, Margaret said finally. She doesn't need to know, Nathaniel said. Nathaniel. She would feel obligated, he said. She would think she owed me something, and I don't want... He stopped, set his pen down. I don't want that to be the reason she... He stopped again. Margaret watched him not finish 2 sentences with the compassion of a woman who understood exactly what he was failing to say. Oh, my dear boy, she said quietly. He picked up his pen. The third dinner is in 2 weeks, he said. It is, Margaret agreed. I'll see her then. Margaret stood. You will, she said. She moved toward the door, stopped. Nathaniel, she said. He looked up. She would not feel obligated, Margaret said gently. She would feel something else entirely. She paused. I know her rather well by now. She left him with that. He sat in the study for a long time afterward, looking at the ledgers, not reading them, thinking about a woman who brought preserved blackberries to someone who had mentioned in passing that the crop was thin, who remembered a sick child, who paid attention when people spoke. Who would, he was beginning to believe with something close to certainty, have done exactly the same thing for him, if he had needed her to, if he had needed anyone at all. The 2 weeks between the August dinner and the September gathering were the longest 2 weeks Nathaniel Whitmore had experienced in recent memory, and he was honest enough with himself by now to admit why. He worked. He always worked. The estate did not run itself, and the Northfield acquisition had generated a chain of legal and logistical consequences that kept his solicitor arriving at the house 3 mornings a week with papers that required his full attention. He gave them his full attention. He reviewed contracts, signed documents, met with Thomas Reach about the autumn planting, and handled the particular cascade of small crises that came with running the largest property in Piedmont County. He also rode the Eastern Road twice, not to see anything, not to do anything. Just, he told himself, to monitor the condition of the surface now that the summer heat had baked the gravel hard. The assessment his estate manager had completed sat on his desk. He'd read it 4 times. He knew every rut, every weak point, every place where the road would fail first under winter weight. He was going to do something about the road. That was a separate decision, practical, and already made nothing to do with anything else. Roads mattered. Load tolerance mattered. The people who used the Eastern Road because they had no other road to take, they mattered. He didn't let himself follow that thought all the way to its end. The county, however, had no such restraint. It started as most things started in Piedmont County, with someone telling someone else something at a social occasion where they ought to have known better. In this case, it was Frederick Dunmore, who had not forgiven Nathaniel for the coat rack incident or the dinner table correction, and who had apparently decided that the best response to humiliation was information. Nathaniel heard it from Thomas Reach first on a Wednesday morning, delivered with the careful neutrality of a man who considered it his job to tell his employer things his employer needed to know. "There's talk," Reach said, not looking up from the fence line they were inspecting. "About you and the Carter woman." Nathaniel kept walking. "What kind of talk?" "The kind that starts at Dunmore's supper table and ends up at the feed store by Thursday morning." Reach paused. "They're saying you went to Hargrove on her behalf, got her position kept." "I had a business discussion with James Hargrove about easement rights," Nathaniel said. "That's one version," Reach said. Nathaniel stopped walking. Reach stopped beside him. "What else are they saying?" Nathaniel asked. Reach was quiet for the moment. He was a man who understood that there were ways to deliver information, and that some of them were worse than others. "They're saying she's working her way up," he said carefully. "That she set her sights on you. That a woman in her position, no family, no money, getting your protection, getting your interference in her employer's decisions." He stopped. "They're calling it deliberate." Nathaniel stood very still. "And what are they calling her?" he asked. The pause before Reach answered was long enough to be its own answer. "Nothing I'd repeat to you," Reach said. He did not go to Elizabeth Carter. He wanted to. He sat in his study that evening and had the conversation with himself 3 separate times. What he would say, how he would say it, whether warning her was the right thing, or whether warning her would tell her something he wasn't ready to say out loud yet. He decided not to go. Then he decided he should go. Then he decided that arriving at a woman's place of employment in the evening to tell her that people were saying unkind things about her would accomplish exactly nothing except confirming to anyone who saw him that the talk was worth having. He stayed home. He did not sleep particularly well. Margaret came to breakfast the next morning with the expression of a woman who had also not slept particularly well, which told him more than he wanted to know about how widely the talk had traveled. "You've heard," he said. "I've heard," she said. She poured her coffee herself the way she always did when she was thinking about something she didn't want to dilute with small gestures. Catherine Hargrove sent me a note. About the conversation apparently going around that Elizabeth has been... Margaret set the coffee pot down. Scheming, that's the word being used. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. She hasn't schemed a thing, he said. I know that, Margaret said. You know that. Elizabeth knows that. She sat down. The question is, what happens to a woman's reputation in this county when that word gets attached to her name, whether it's true or not? He looked at his plate. They'll make her unemployable, he said. If it goes far enough, yes. Margaret wrapped both hands around her cup. James Hargrove is a man who cares very much about what the county thinks of him. If the county decides that retaining Elizabeth makes him look like a fool who was manipulated... She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. She did nothing, Nathaniel said. The flatness in his voice was the kind that came from pressing very hard against something he wasn't willing to let through. She did nothing. Margaret agreed. She came to dinner. She sat beside you. She spoke honestly and paid attention and kept her own counsel. And now she's being punished for it because the women who wanted your attention can't find any other explanation for why they didn't get it. Nathaniel pushed back from the table and stood. I have to go to her, he said. Nathaniel. She needs to know, he said. Before she hears it from someone else. Before she goes into town or to market or anywhere in this county and hears her own name turned into something ugly. He reached for his hat. She deserves to hear it from me. And what will you tell her? Margaret asked quietly. He stopped. What will you tell her? She repeated. That you're sorry, that the county is wrong. Those things are true, but they don't help her. She looked at him with the full, steady weight of her gaze. The only thing that helps her now, Nathaniel, is what you decide you're willing to do about it. The room was very quiet. She's not going to ask you for anything, Margaret said. You know that. She would rather lose every position in the county than ask you to put yourself out on her behalf. She paused. So the question isn't whether to warn her. The question is whether you are willing to make it stop. He looked at his aunt. By doing what? He said. Margaret looked at him for a long time. With the patience and the love and the absolute unflinching honesty of a woman who had been waiting 3 summers for him to be standing exactly where he was standing. By being clear, she said, about what she means to you. He rode to the Hargrove estate on a Friday morning. He did not send word ahead. He arrived at the front door, gave his card to the startled housemaid who answered, and asked for Miss Carter. The maid disappeared. Returned. Said Miss Carter was in the kitchen accounts room and would come to the front parlor directly. He waited in the front parlor for 4 minutes. Elizabeth Carter came through the door with her ledger still under her arm, and her hair not quite as precisely arranged as it was at dinner parties, and she looked at him with the immediate assessment of a woman who could read a room in 3 seconds. Mr. Whitmore, she said, not alarmed, not pleased, just present, waiting. Miss Carter, he said, I need to speak with you. She set the ledger on the side table. All right, there's talk in the county, he said. He'd decided on the ride over that there was no version of this that was gentle and that she would prefer direct anyway. About you, about the dinner parties, about my going to see Hargrove. He met her eyes. They're saying you've been working to secure my attention, deliberately. That you've been scheming, she said. He stopped. I heard yesterday, she said, from the market. Mrs. Tolliver didn't mean for me to hear it. She was speaking to her daughter near the flour barrels. She said it without drama, without tears, with the steady quality of a person absorbing a blow they had been somewhere in the back of their mind half expecting. You didn't say anything, he said. At dinner. You weren't at dinner yesterday, she said. I was at the market. He stared at her. Elizabeth, he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and they both registered it. Why didn't you send word? Why didn't you send word to you about what exactly, she said. Not sharp, just precise. That people are saying unkind things about me, that's not news you require. That's not a problem you can solve. She picked up her ledger from the table. It will pass. Things like this always pass. They don't always pass, he said. Not for women in your position. Not in this county. She looked at him. No, she said quietly. You're right. They don't. Something in her face, she had control of it. She always had control of it. But something moved underneath. The weight of it. The specific accumulated exhaustion of a woman who has survived one hard thing after another by telling herself it will pass and sometimes being wrong. Sit down, he said. She blinked. I beg your pardon. Please, he said. Sit down. She sat not because she was complying, but because she was choosing to, which he understood was a different thing. He sat across from her. The parlor was somebody else's room. Floral wallpaper, somebody's grandmother's furniture, and it was the wrong setting entirely for what he was about to say, but he'd stopped caring about settings. I want to ask you something, he said, and I want you to answer it honestly. I generally do, she said. Do you know why my aunt kept placing you beside me at dinner? She was quiet for a moment. I assumed she felt sorry for me, she said finally. A kindness, including me somewhere I wouldn't otherwise be included. That's not why, he said. She looked at him. She placed you there, he said, because she believed you were the only person in those rooms who was seeing me. Not the estate, not the inheritance, me. He held her gaze. She was right. Elizabeth Carter did not move. And I went to Hargrove, he continued, not because I wanted you to feel obligated to me, not because I wanted anything from you. I went because the thought of you losing your position, because James Hargrove cares more about a family name than about a woman who has been keeping his books clean for 4 years. He stopped, steadied. I couldn't sit here and know that was happening and do nothing. You should have told me, she said, and her voice was not accusatory, but there was something in it, a tightness and edge that told him she meant it. I know, he said. I don't want to be managed, she said. I have spent my entire life being the person that circumstances happen to. I need to know when. She stopped, pressed her lips together. I need to know. You're right, he said. I'm sorry. She looked at him, directly, the way she always looked at things without flinching, without performance. Why are you here? She asked. Right now. This morning. What are you trying to tell me? He held her gaze. That I'm not going to let them do this to you, he said. She shook her head, small and quick. You can't stop what people say. I can make it irrelevant, he said. Silence. What does that mean? She said carefully. He had thought about this on the ride over. He had thought about it at 3 a.m, staring at the ceiling. He had thought about it in every unguarded moment for the past 2 weeks. It means, he said, that I want to court you, properly, openly, so that every person in this county who is telling each other that you've been scheming has to look at the fact that I am choosing this, not being manipulated into it, choosing it. Elizabeth Carter stared at him. The clock on the mantelpiece counted 8 seconds. You want to court me, she said. Yes. To protect my reputation. No, he said. To do what I should have done 6 weeks ago and been honest about what I wanted. She stood up. He stood automatically, and then they were both standing in somebody else's parlor with the morning light coming through the curtains, and she was looking at him with an expression he had never seen on her face before. Not the level, composed quality. Not the careful steadiness. Something underneath that, something raw and undefended and frightened. I am not a practical decision, she said. I have no family name, no fortune, nothing that helps you in this county. The people who are already talking if you court me openly, they won't just talk about me, they'll talk about you. I know, he said. Your position, Elizabeth. He said her name again and again, they both registered it. I have spent my entire adult life being looked at for what I have. Every conversation, every dinner, every introduction, people see the estate before they see me. You have never once done that." He took one step toward her. One. "Do you understand how rare that is? Do you understand that I have sat beside you at 3 dinners and laughed more genuinely and thought more clearly and felt more like a person and less like an inheritance than I have in the past 10 years? She was very still. "You deserve to be seen," he said, "by someone who is willing to stand where everyone can watch and be absolutely clear about it." She looked at him for a long time. "I'm not going to fall in love with your position," she said finally. "I know. Or your money. I know. And if this goes wrong," she said, "I am the one who loses more. My employment, my reputation, every door in this county." He held her gaze and didn't flinch from that. Because it was true, and she deserved to have it acknowledged as true. "Yes," he said. "That's not fair. And I won't pretend it is." She looked down at the ledger in her hands, then back up at him. "Give me 3 days," she said. He nodded. She left the room without another word, and he stood alone in somebody else's parlor, feeling for the first time in a very long time that the outcome of something mattered enormously to him. The county did not wait 3 days. By Saturday, the talk had sharpened into something with more edges to it. Nathaniel heard it at the feed cooperative, where 2 men stopped talking when he walked in and resumed at half volume when they thought he was out of earshot. He heard the shape of it, not the words, but the tone, the particular register of men discussing a woman's motives with the easy authority of people who have never had to consider what it costs to survive without resources. He bought what he'd come for and left. He ran into Thomas Hale on the road back. Hale pulled up his horse with the expression of a man who has been rehearsing something and isn't sure he should say it. "Whitmore," he said, "I want you to know I don't give credit to the talk, for what it's worth." "What talk specifically?" Nathaniel said. Hale looked slightly uncomfortable. "Dunmore's been saying you've been taken advantage of, that the woman had a plan from the start." He paused. "I don't believe that, but I want to warn you he's not keeping it quiet. He's going to the Alderton dinner on Tuesday, and you know how that table spreads things." Nathaniel looked at Hale with a steadiness he did not entirely feel. "Thank you, Thomas," he said. "What are you going to do?" Hale asked. "What needs to be done?" Nathaniel said, and rode on. Elizabeth's 3 days ended on a Monday. He didn't go to her. He waited. She came to him. He was in the study when Mrs. Aldrich appeared in the doorway with the slightly wide-eyed expression of a woman who had been presented with an unusual social situation and was handling it with professional composure. "Miss Carter at the front door, sir," she said. "She says she'll wait if you're occupied." "I'm not occupied," he said. He was in the front hall in 30 seconds. Elizabeth Carter stood just inside the door. She had her good cloak on, the dark wool one he'd seen on her once before, and her hair was arranged precisely, and she was holding her hands in front of her without gripping them, which he understood by now was something she did when she was working to appear calmer than she was. "I've been to see your aunt," she said. He went still. "When?" "This morning, early." She met his eyes. "I wanted to talk to her before I talked to you. I needed to know what she thought, about all of it. And," she said, Elizabeth said carefully, "that she placed me at your table because she believed I was the only person who could see you clearly, and that she was tired of watching you be lonely in a crowded room." The front hall was very quiet. She also said, Elizabeth continued, and now there was something in her voice, a careful, controlled, real quality that meant she was speaking from the part of herself she didn't expose often, that the people in this county can say whatever they like, and that the only thing that matters is what's true. "She's right," he said. "I know she's right," Elizabeth said. "I have known she was right for years, but knowing something is right and trusting it are not the same thing." She took a breath. "I have spent 6 years being careful. Not asking for things I couldn't afford to lose. Not hoping for things that seemed too large. Not opening doors that I wasn't sure I could close again if I needed to. He didn't say anything. He let her finish. You went to Hargrove for me, she said, without telling me, without asking me, without making me feel it was a transaction. Her voice was very controlled and very real at the same time, and he understood that that combination was costing her something. You did it because you couldn't not do it, and I've been angry about that, not at you, just at the situation, and also— She stopped. Also, he said. Also, it's the kindest thing anyone has done for me since my father died, she said. The words landed in the room and stayed there. He crossed the hall, stopped in front of her. Yes, she said, quietly, directly. He looked at her. Yes, she said again, with more certainty this time. To your question. From Friday. He took her into the county on Tuesday morning, not quietly, not subtly. He came to the Hargrove estate in his good coat on his best horse, and he helped Elizabeth Carter into the carriage in front of anyone who happened to be watching, and he drove the main road into Clover Hill at a pace that was neither hurried nor apologetic. They went to the dry goods store, the post office, the county land office where he had business, and she waited in the carriage, and 3 people walked past and stared. He came back out of the land office and handed up a small wrapped parcel from the dry goods man's shelf, peppermints, because he had noticed at 3 dinners that she always took one from the dish Margaret kept on the sideboard and thought no one was watching. She looked at the parcel, looked at him. You noticed that, she said. I notice most things, he said. I've been paying attention. She looked at him for a long moment with something moving in her face that was not quite a smile and not quite tears and was entirely Elizabeth Carter. Thank you, she said. He climbed back into the carriage. Frederick Dunmore saw them at the post office. He was standing outside it when they came out, the kind of meeting that could have been coincidence and probably wasn't. Whitmore, he said. Dunmore, Nathaniel said. Dunmore looked at Elizabeth beside him. She met his eyes without expression, without backing away, with the same level quality she brought to everything. I see you've been— Dunmore started. Making myself clear, Nathaniel said. Yes. People are talking. I know what people are saying, Nathaniel said. I want to be specific about what the truth is, so there's no confusion. He looked at Dunmore with a directness that was not hostile and was not soft. Miss Carter has never asked me for a thing. Not a dinner invitation, not a word in her employer's ear, not a favor of any kind. Whatever I have done because I chose to. If people want to talk about choices in this county, they can talk about mine, but they will leave her name out of it. Dunmore opened his mouth. I mean that, Nathaniel said, quiet, final. In the way that I don't say things twice. Dunmore closed his mouth. He stepped aside. Nathaniel helped Elizabeth back into the carriage, and they drove down the main street of Clover Hill, with the September sun on the road and the whole county watching, and beside him Elizabeth sat straight-backed and quiet, and did not say a word for 3 full minutes. Then she said, You said that very well. Thank you, he said. You meant it, she said. Every word. She looked at the road ahead. I'm still frightened, she said. I want you to know that. I'm not— This isn't easy for me. Letting someone— She stopped. I'm not practiced at this. Neither am I, he said. She looked at him sideways. You're better at the public part. I've had more practice performing confidence, he said. It's not the same as having it. She was quiet for a moment. What are you frightened of? She asked. He thought about it honestly, the way she always forced him to think about things. That you'll decide the cost is too high, he said. That what I can offer isn't worth what you'd have to survive to get there. He kept his eyes on the road. That you'll be sensible about it. She was quiet. I've been sensible for 6 years, she said. He looked at her. "I'm quite tired of being sensible," she said. For the first time in that long, strange, difficult morning, he smiled. A real one, the kind that moved more of his face than he intended. She looked at the road, and something happened in her expression, that door opening. More than half an inch this time, more than it had ever opened. Something like warmth, something like hope, something she was still being careful with, but no longer hiding. They drove back through Piedmont County in the long afternoon light, and behind them, the county watched and talked and drew its conclusions, and ahead of them, the road opened out toward the estate on the hill, visible for 3 miles, and neither of them said anything about that because neither of them needed to. The hill was just a hill. The house was just a house. What mattered was the road they were on, and who was sitting beside them on it. The county had its opinion about Nathaniel Whitmore and Elizabeth Carter, and it expressed that opinion the way it expressed all opinions, loudly, selectively, and with the confidence of people who were not involved. The Alderton dinner on Tuesday produced 3 separate conversations about the matter, which Margaret heard about through Catherine Hargrove, who heard about them through her sister, who attended the dinner and had the presence of mind to remember what was said and by whom. The general consensus assembled from those 3 conversations was something like this. Nathaniel Whitmore had temporarily lost his judgment. The woman had been clever. It would pass. Margaret listened to all of this and said nothing. She had learned in 62 years that the moments when you most wanted to speak were often the moments that most required you to stay quiet. What was happening between Nathaniel and Elizabeth did not need her voice. It needed time and privacy, and the particular dignity of being allowed to unfold without commentary. She stayed quiet. She watched, and she noticed things that nobody else was close enough to see. She noticed that Nathaniel, for the first time in years, came to breakfast in the morning without the careful managed distance he'd been wearing like a coat since his father died. She noticed that he laughed more quickly and apologized more readily, and looked at things, the property, the accounts, the people around him, with the particular attention of someone who was seeing clearly again after a long period of not quite being able to focus. She noticed that Elizabeth Carter, over the weeks following that Tuesday drive through Clover Hill, began to arrive at things slightly less armored. Still precise, still direct. Still the woman who had navigated every hard year of her life with nothing but her own good sense and her own steady hands. But the door that had been cracking open through 3 summers of dinner parties was now unmistakably open. Not wide. Elizabeth was not a woman who opened doors wide all at once. But open. Margaret thought about the conversation she'd had with Elizabeth on that Monday morning, before Elizabeth had gone to Nathaniel with her answer. Elizabeth had sat across from her in the morning room and said very quietly, "I don't know how to trust something this large." And Margaret had said, "I know. But I want you to consider that Nathaniel doesn't either, and he's trying anyway." That had been the thing. Not the estate, not the position, not the fact that he was the most prominent man in Piedmont County. And she was a household manager with 3 dresses and a set of clean account ledgers. The fact that he was frightened too and showing up anyway. That was the thing Elizabeth had needed to hear. 3 weeks into October, Nathaniel's mother wrote from Philadelphia. He read the letter at his desk in the early morning before anyone else in the house was awake, which was when he read things he needed to read alone. It was 2 pages in his mother's precise, slanted hand, and the first page was about Philadelphia. The weather, a dinner she had attended, news about a cousin who was expecting her 3rd child. The second page was about Elizabeth Carter. He didn't know how his mother had heard. He suspected the Alderton connection. One of the daughters had a school friend in Philadelphia whose mother moved in the same social circles. It didn't matter how it had traveled. It had traveled. That was the thing about information in this part of the world. It moved faster than horses. His mother's letter was not cruel. He would have preferred cruel in some ways. Cruel was easy to dismiss. His mother's letter was careful and loving and practical, which was much harder to push against. "I understand you have developed an interest in a woman of limited circumstances," she wrote. I do not say this to wound you, or to be uncharitable toward the individual in question of whom I know nothing personally. I say it because I know the weight a choice like this carries for a man in your position. Your father spent his life building what you now hold. The people who will extend your credit, negotiate your contracts, receive your family, they will make judgments. They already are. I only ask you to be certain, truly certain. Before you go further, he read the letter twice. Then he folded it, put it in the desk drawer, and went to find Elizabeth. She was at the estate. She came 3 mornings a week now, helping Margaret with the household correspondence and accounts, an arrangement Margaret had proposed, and Elizabeth had accepted with the careful consideration she brought to everything. It was legitimate work, real work. The kind Elizabeth didn't do halfway. He found her in the small room off the library that Margaret used as a correspondence office. She was at the desk writing, and she looked up when he came in with the quick assessment she always made before her expression settled into whatever was appropriate for the situation. She read his face in 3 seconds. "Bad news," she said, not a question. "My mother," he said, and held out the letter. She took it, read it. He watched her face while she read, which told him more than the letter did. The small, careful stillness that came over her when she was absorbing something hard. The almost imperceptible tightening at the corners of her eyes. She folded it and handed it back. "She loves you," Elizabeth said. "Yes. And she's not wrong," Elizabeth said, "about the practical reality." He looked at her. "She's not entirely right either." Elizabeth stood up from the desk. She moved to the window, not to look out of it, just to be moving, because Elizabeth Carter, when she was thinking through something difficult, needed her body to be doing something. "My mother died when I was 19. She said, not looking at him. "I told you my father built his business from nothing. What I haven't told you is that he built it partly on credit, on the trust of men in his community who believed he was a man of character. When he died, that credit died with him. The people who had extended it to him did not extend it to me because I was his daughter and not his son, and the law and the custom both said that what he built was no longer mine to steward." She turned around. "I know exactly what it means to be the wrong kind of person at the wrong kind of table, Nathaniel." He did not miss that she had used his given name. She had been doing it more often privately, the way you use something carefully that you've only recently allowed yourself to have. "And," he said, "and I am not asking you to choose against your mother," she said, "or against your position, or against what your father built." She met his eyes directly. "I told you from the beginning that I would never want anything from you that you shouldn't give. I meant that. What if I want to give it?" he said. She looked at him. "What if the choice isn't between you and my position?" he said. "What if the choice is between who I've been trying to be all this time and who I actually am?" She was very still. "That's a large thing to say," she said quietly. "Yes," he said. "It is." He crossed the room, stopped 3 feet from her, close enough that they were having a different kind of conversation than the one conducted at dinner tables and in front of parlor windows. "I have managed this estate for 12 years, he said. "I have been careful and correct and dutiful. I have sat at the head of every table this county has put me at and said the right things and made the right decisions and done what was expected of a man in my position." He held her gaze. "I have been entirely prepared for the life I was supposed to want." "Nathaniel, I have been lonely," he said. "For a long time. In a house full of people and a county full of social engagements, and I have felt very little that was real." He stopped, drew a breath. "Until 3 dinners in a summer when a woman sat beside me and disagreed with me about road measurements, and brought my aunt preserved blackberries and told me that honesty requires less memory than strategy." Something moved in Elizabeth's face. The door. Wide open now. She was not hiding it. "I am certain," he said. "That is the answer to my mother's letter. I am completely, clearly, without reservation, certain." She looked at him for a long moment. What does that mean? She asked. Going forward. Practically. It means I am going to speak to Margaret, he said. And then to you have no family, I know. But there are people whose opinion matters to you. I want to do this correctly. You want to do this correctly? She repeated, and there was something in it. The faintest warmth, the faintest disbelief, the faintest quality of a woman who has been waiting for things to go wrong and is starting to believe cautiously that this one might not. I want to do everything with you correctly, he said. She looked at him for 5 full seconds without speaking. Then she said, You should probably write your mother back first. He almost laughed. Probably. She deserves a real answer, Elizabeth said. Not a social answer. A real one. I know, he said. Will you help me? She blinked. Help you write to your mother. You write letters better than I do, he said. You wrote the Hargrove quarterly correspondence, and their solicitor told James it was the clearest communication he'd received from that household in years. I am not helping you write a letter to your mother about me, she said with a precision that was fighting to stay serious and losing. About us, he said. She looked at him. The door wide open, something entirely real in her face. No, she said, and she was almost smiling now. You're on your own for that one. Margaret was in the garden when Nathaniel came to find her an hour later. She was not gardening. She was sitting in the garden the way she sometimes sat in it, occupying it, taking the air thinking. She looked up when he came through the gate and moved along the path to sit beside her on the bench. She waited. I want to ask for your blessing, he said. Margaret looked at him. Her eyes were very bright. For Elizabeth, he said. Unnecessary. She knew. You have it, she said, immediately, without ceremony. He looked at her. Don't you want to think about it? I have been thinking about it for 3 years, she said. I've been done thinking about it for 2. He sat back. 3 summers, he said. 3 summers, she agreed. You planned this from the beginning, he said. I placed 2 people near each other and trusted them to do the rest, she said. Which is all any of us can do for anyone. He was quiet for a moment. Around them, October had put its hands on the garden, the leaves turning the air, sharpening the particular quality of Virginia in the fall that smelled like change. Why her? He asked. From the start. Before you knew what she'd mean to me. Why did you see it? Margaret was quiet. She looked at her hands in her lap. And then she said something she had been saving for a long time, for exactly this conversation, on exactly this kind of morning. When your father died, she said, I watched you take on everything he had built, and I watched you do it well. Better than he had in some ways, more careful, more thorough. You were 22 years old, and you never once asked anyone for help, and I admired you deeply, and it frightened me. He looked at her. Because a man who never asks for help, she said, is a man who has decided he doesn't deserve any, not consciously, not in a way he can name, but underneath. She turned to look at him directly. You have been running this estate for 12 years, like a man who is trying to prove something to a father who is no longer here to see it. The bench was very still. I watched hundreds of women come through this county and try to get close to you, Margaret continued. And every single one of them wanted the estate, or the name, or the position, and every single one of them confirmed what you already believed, that you were alone inside all of this. That the thing people wanted was the thing around you, not you. Nathaniel did not say anything. Elizabeth Carter sat beside you at my dinner table, Margaret said, and treated you like a man, not an inheritance, not a position. A man who was sometimes wrong and sometimes proud, and sometimes said things in a flat way that were rude and didn't know it. She paused. A man who deserved to be seen. He looked at the garden. She told me once, Margaret said, in the early days before any of this, that she found you interesting. He turned. She said that, She said you were interesting in the way that people are interesting when they're unhappy in a way they don't recognize. Margaret's voice was very gentle. She saw it before I named it to her. That's when I knew. He thought about Elizabeth Carter at 19, managing her father's business accounts in the middle of grief, learning that honesty requires less memory than strategy. He thought about her arriving at dinner parties in a dress that had been altered so many times it had developed a character of its own, and sitting quietly and paying attention, and never once reaching for something she hadn't earned. He thought about what it had cost her to say yes. "I want to take care of her," he said, and it came out rough at the edges, unpolished real. "I know," Margaret said. "I want her to have—" He stopped. "Everything she's been managing without for 6 years. Security. A home that's truly hers. People who know her value." "Then tell her that," Margaret said. "Not me." "I'm going to," he said. "Good." She patted his hand once with the brisk warmth of a woman who has made her point. "Then go do it." He went back to the correspondence room. Elizabeth was still there, but she had stopped writing. She was sitting with her hands in her lap, looking at the desk with the expression of a person thinking through something large. She looked up when he came in. "What did she say?" Elizabeth asked. "She said yes before I finished asking," he said. Something moved across Elizabeth's face. She pressed her lips together briefly, the thing she did when she was working to stay composed, and then she looked at the desk again. "I owe her a great deal," Elizabeth said quietly. "She'd disagree," Nathaniel said. "She'd be wrong," Elizabeth said. "She's been wrong before. She just doesn't often admit it." "She placed you beside me," he said. 3 summers. She did. Elizabeth folded her hands. "Do you know the first summer, the first dinner, I almost didn't come. I'd heard that you were—" She paused. "That you were difficult. That you looked through people. That you were the kind of man who was so accustomed to being the most important person in every room that he'd stopped seeing the rooms." He winced slightly. "Was that an inaccurate description?" "Partially," she said. "You did look through people, but it wasn't arrogance." She looked at him. It was something lonelier than arrogance. He said nothing. "I stayed at the table because you defended me," she said. "The first dinner. Clara Pembroke's comment about domestic temperament." She met his eyes. "You didn't have to do that. It cost you something socially, and you did it anyway. I spent the whole of the second course trying to figure out why." "And," he said, "and I decided you were unpredictable," she said, "which is the most interesting quality a person can have." He looked at her. "You stayed because I was unpredictable." "I came back the second summer because I was curious," she said. "And the third." She tilted her head. "And then you smiled. At dinner. A real smile. And I thought—" She stopped. "What?" he said. "I thought there he is," she said quietly. "The actual person, underneath all of it." The correspondence room was very quiet. He crossed to the desk. She looked up at him, and he understood standing there that this was the most undefended he had ever seen her, not because she was being fragile, but because she had decided deliberately and at real cost to let him see her clearly. The same way she had seen him clearly from the beginning, returning the gift. "I want to marry you," he said. She held his gaze. "I know." "I'm asking," he said. She was quiet for 3 full seconds. "I know," she said again, and this time there was something different in it. Something that was not deflection. Something that was its own kind of yes, arriving at its own pace in its own form. "Elizabeth," he said. "Yes," she said. Directly. Simply. The way she said everything. "Yes." The county heard about the engagement in the way the county heard about everything all at once, from 17 different directions within approximately 48 hours. The reactions Margaret reported to Nathaniel, with the precise inventory of a woman who had been paying very close attention, ranged across a considerable spectrum. Catherine Hargrove cried, which she later said was happiness, but which Margaret privately thought was also relief, because Elizabeth had been managing the Hargrove household through 3 children's illnesses and 2 financial panics, and Catherine had never once said thank you, and now she was going to have to find someone else to do all of that, and some part of her recognized the scale of what she was losing. James Hargrove said nothing, which was his response to situations he didn't know how to navigate. Thomas Hale sent a note of congratulations that was genuine and slightly surprised, which Nathaniel found more honest than a note that was only one of those things. Frederick Dunmore said nothing publicly. Nathaniel heard through Thomas Reach that Dunmore had made one comment at a private supper something dismissive, and that 2 other men at that supper had disagreed with him, which was more interesting to Nathaniel than the comment itself. The Alderton daughters apparently were mostly concerned about who would now be seated beside Nathaniel at dinner parties, which Margaret reported with a dry humor that suggested she had her own opinions about this. And then there was the letter from Nathaniel's mother. It arrived 6 days after he'd written to her. He'd written the letter himself without Elizabeth's help, and it had taken him 4 drafts to say what he meant in a way that was honest without being a speech. He had written, "I want you to know that I am not asking you to approve of a decision I have already made. I am writing to tell you the truth about it. This woman sees me. Not the estate, not father's name, not what I have built or what I might give her. She sees the man underneath all of that, and she chose him knowing full well what it cost her to do so. I have been trying to be worthy of this estate for 12 years. I would like to spend the next 12 years trying to be worthy of something more important." His mother's response arrived in 6 days. He read it at his desk. It was 1 page, not 2. His mother's slanted hand, familiar as his own face in glass. "Bring her to Philadelphia this winter," she wrote. "I find I want to meet the woman who made my son write a letter like that one. If she has made you capable of saying those things, she is already someone I intend to respect. Your father would have liked her. I am quite certain of it." He read the letter twice. Then he went to find Elizabeth. She was in the library, which she had begun to use as though it were partly hers, which it was going to be, and which she had not yet quite let herself believe. She looked up when he came in and read his face in the 3 seconds she always needed. "Good news," she said. "My mother wants to meet you," he said. Something shifted in her expression. Not alarm. Something more complicated, the particular look of a person confronting the reality of something they had agreed to in principle and were now encountering in practice. "Philadelphia," she said. "This winter." She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the book in her hands, then back at him. "I've never been to Philadelphia," she said. "I'll take you," he said. She looked at him with the expression that had replaced the careful composure over these past weeks. The open one, the real one, the one that let him see all the way in. "I'm going to be nervous," she said. "So am I," he said. She blinked. "You're nervous about introducing me to your mother. I'm nervous about everything going right," he said. "When you have spent a long time expecting things to go wrong, going right is its own kind of frightening." She looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said quietly. "It is." She set the book down. She stood. She crossed the room toward him with the straight-backed, unhurried quality she brought to everything, and she stopped in front of him and she reached out and took his hand. Not tentatively, not with the particular care of someone still deciding. Just took it. Held it. "Then we'll be frightened together," she said. He looked down at her hand in his. The hand that had kept clean books and managed other people's households and held itself steady through 6 years of hard things. The hand that had taken the paper package of preserved blackberries to a woman who had mentioned once in passing that the crop was thin. He covered it with his other hand. "Yes," he said. "We will." Outside, Piedmont County continued its conversations. The Alderton daughters had opinions. Frederick Dunmore had opinions. The county had been having opinions about Nathaniel Whitmore since the day he inherited the estate, and it would continue having opinions for as long as there was something worth discussing. But in the library, with the autumn light coming in, and the quiet of the house around them, there were two people holding hands and being frightened together, and the county's opinions had never felt less relevant. Margaret walked past the library door, not stopping, not interrupting, just passing the way a woman passes something she has been hoping to see for a very long time. She continued down the hall without breaking stride. She was smiling. She did not try to hide it. She had earned it. Philadelphia in December was a different world from Piedmont County, and Nathaniel watched Elizabeth discover this with the particular attention of a man who wanted to remember everything. She did not show nervousness the way most people showed nervousness, no fidgeting, no excessive talking, no manufactured brightness. She showed it the way she showed everything precisely. A slight increase in the deliberateness of her movements. The way she straightened her collar twice before they reached his mother's front door. The way she held her hands in front of her without gripping them. He had come to know that gesture. It meant she was working very hard to stay exactly as calm as she appeared. He reached over in the carriage and covered her hands with his. She looked at him. "You've already survived everything the county could throw at you," he said. "One mother is significantly less difficult." "Your mother is not one mother," Elizabeth said. "Your mother is the woman who raised you and whose opinion of me will shape every family dinner for the rest of our lives." "Fair point," he said. "Also, I've heard she's very sharp." "She is," he agreed. "You'll like each other." Elizabeth looked at him with the expression that meant she was deciding whether to believe him. "How can you be certain?" "Because she wrote to me that any woman who made me capable of writing that letter was someone she intended to respect," he said. "And because you are the two most direct people I have ever met, and you will spend the first 20 minutes taking each other's measure, and the next 20 deciding you agree on most things." She was quiet for a moment. "What did you write to her?" she asked. "Exactly." He had told her the general shape of the letter, not the words. "I told her you see me," he said, "the actual me, and that I had been trying to be worthy of the estate for 12 years and wanted to spend the next 12 years trying to be worthy of something more important." Elizabeth looked at him for a long moment. "That's what you wrote," she said. "Yes." She looked at her hands. His hands. Both of them together. "Nathaniel," she said. "I'm going to be fine," she said, not performing certainty, actually finding it. He watched her locate it somewhere inside herself, the way she always did, not from external reassurance, but from her own steady interior, the thing that had kept her upright through 6 years of hard things. She straightened her spine. "Let's go meet your mother," she said. Jug. Caroline Whitmore was 60 years old and had her son's eyes and none of his managed restraint. She opened the door herself, which was not what either of them expected, and looked at Elizabeth Carter for exactly 3 seconds with the focused attention of a woman who had decided to form her own opinion and not accept anyone else's. Then she said, "You're taller than I imagined." Elizabeth said, "You're younger than I imagined." Caroline Whitmore smiled. It moved her whole face the way Nathaniel's smiles moved his when they were real. "Come in," she said. "Both of you. It's cold." Nathaniel stood in the doorway of his mother's Philadelphia house and watched the two of them walk inside together, already talking, and felt something settle in his chest that had been unsettled for a very long time. He followed them in and closed the door. They stayed 4 days. The first evening, Caroline asked Elizabeth about the grain business, her father's business, the accounts, the years after his death. She asked with the directness of a woman who understood that the polite version of these questions was also the dishonest version, and that Elizabeth Carter would prefer honest. She was right. Elizabeth talked about those years with the clean, unsentimental quality she brought to everything difficult. "Here is what happened. Here is what I did here. Is what it cost. No performance of suffering. No request for sympathy. just the facts of a life laid out clearly by a woman who had made something of them. Caroline listened without interrupting, which was something she did not do for most people. When Elizabeth finished, Caroline was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My husband built this family from very little. He used to say that a person who has made something from nothing understands the value of things better than anyone who inherited them." She looked at Elizabeth. "I think he was right," she said. Nathaniel, from his chair across the room, watched Elizabeth absorb this, the particular quality of receiving something you have needed for a long time from a source you didn't expect. She absorbed it quietly as she absorbed everything, but her hands in her lap were still. Not the working hard to be calm still. Just still. On the third day, Caroline found Nathaniel alone in the morning room. She sat down across from him with the directness that was apparently a family trait, and she said, "She is exactly what I hoped." "I know," he said. "She is also," his mother said, "the kind of woman who will not ask for anything she needs. You understand that. You need to give things before she asks. She won't ask." "I know," he said again. "And she's frightened," Caroline said. "Not of you. Of believing this is real." He looked at his mother. "6 years of managing alone," Caroline said. "A woman doesn't do that without building walls she doesn't always know are there." She paused. "Be patient with the walls." "I intend to be," he said. His mother looked at him for a long moment. The way mothers look at sons when they are deciding whether the person in front of them has become who they hoped. "Your father," she said, "was not always an easy man to love." He waited. "But he was always worth it," she said. "I see you in him, the good parts." She stood. "Don't waste time being careful when what she needs is to feel certain." She left him with that, and he sat in the morning room thinking about certainty and what it looked like when you gave it to someone and how different it was from simply feeling it. They were on the road back to Virginia 2 days later when Elizabeth said without preamble, "She told me to watch out for you." He looked at her. "She said you tend to manage things from the outside instead of saying them from the inside," Elizabeth said. "She said it took your father 10 years to stop doing it, and she'd prefer I not wait 10 years. "My mother told you that," he said. "Over breakfast on the second day," Elizabeth confirmed. "She also told me that the estate's southern accounts have needed restructuring for 3 years, and that you've been putting it off because the man who manages them was your father's oldest friend." He stared at her. She said you'd need someone to tell you it was all right to do the practical thing," Elizabeth said. "She seemed to think I might be that person." He looked at the road ahead. "She's not wrong," he said. "I know she's not," Elizabeth said. "I looked at those accounts in August." He turned to look at her fully. "When you gave me access to the household records," she said, with the composure of a woman who had been sitting on accurate financial observations for 4 months, "the southern accounts were adjacent. The structural issue isn't complicated. It's a categorization problem that compounds quarterly." He stared at her. "You've known this since August," he said. "I didn't want to presume," she said. "Elizabeth." "I know," she said. "Your mother made the same face." He looked at her for a long moment. This woman who had been quietly seeing everything clearly since the first summer dinner, who brought preserved blackberries and remembered sick children and read adjacent account books, and did not presume, who had been managing the world around her with perfect accuracy and perfect restraint for so long that the restraint had become its own kind of habit. "Tell me everything," he said. "Always. Don't wait for me to ask." She looked at him. "Everything," she said. "Every account, every observation, every time you think I'm wrong or being careful when I should be direct or managing from the outside instead of saying things from the inside." He held her gaze. "Everything." Something happened in her face. Not the door opening. The door had been open for weeks now. Something beyond that, the thing that happens after the door when a person walks through it and realizes the room on the other side is safe. "The southern accounts need about 3 weeks of restructuring," she said. The man managing them, your father's friend, is not the problem. He's loyal and he's honest, and he's been working around a structural flaw for years because he didn't want to bring it to your attention. He needs someone to tell him it's all right to fix it. Can you fix it? Nathaniel said. In 3 weeks, she said. Yes. Then you're going to fix it, he said. She nodded once. Business concluded. And then the composure shifted slightly into something warmer. Your mother is going to like being right about me, she said. She's going to be insufferable about it, he agreed. Elizabeth looked at the road ahead with the expression that was almost smiling and entirely real. Good, she said. She deserves to be. They married in January. Not a large affair. Not the kind of wedding Piedmont County might have expected from the Whitmore estate. No 300 guests, no silk imports from Philadelphia, no social performance that lasted 4 days. Margaret had asked Elizabeth what she wanted, and Elizabeth had said with characteristic precision, "The people who matter, good food, no speeches longer than 5 minutes." Margaret had written this down. The ceremony was in the estate's front parlor, where the fireplace made the room warm, and the morning light came in clean and sharp, the way January light does. 12 people. The Hargroves. Catherine cried again, and this time it was purely happiness. Thomas Reach and his wife, because Reach had been with the estate since Nathaniel's father, and because Elizabeth had over the past months developed a friendship with Reach's wife, built on their shared opinion that the men around them required more management than they admitted. Margaret at the center of everything and pretending to be at the edge of it. And Caroline Whitmore, who had come down from Philadelphia for the week, and who sat in the front with the expression of a woman who had been right about something important and was not saying "I told you so" purely out of grace. The ceremony was brief and real. The words were the old words, the ones that meant what they said, and when Nathaniel said them, he said them at a volume and with a directness that left nobody in the room uncertain about what he meant. Elizabeth said them back. Steady, sure, in the voice she used when she was stating facts about the world. Afterward, Margaret stood with Nathaniel in the brief space between the ceremony and the meal, while the other guests moved around them, and she took his arm the way she had taken it since he was a boy. Well, she said. Well, he said. 3 summers, she said. 3 summers, he agreed. She looked at Elizabeth across the room, standing with Caroline, their 2 heads angled toward each other, already deep in a conversation that looked specific and real. The conversation of 2 women who respected each other and had things to discuss. She's going to restructure the Southern accounts, Nathaniel said. I know, Margaret said. She told me in October. He looked at his aunt. She told you in October. She needed someone to tell her it wasn't overstepping, Margaret said serenely. I told her it was exactly the right amount of stepping. He shook his head. The 2 of you have been talking about my accounts for 2 months. 3, Margaret said. We also discussed the East Barn timber situation and the tenant-farmer contracts. Margaret. She was right about all of it, Margaret said simply. I wasn't going to stop her from being right. He looked across the room at his wife. His wife. The words still carrying the particular weight of something real and recent, and felt the thing that had been settling in his chest since Philadelphia complete itself. The last piece of something coming home. Why did you really do it? He said, not accusatory, just wanting the whole truth on this day of all days. 3 summers, all of it. What made you see it before anyone else did? Margaret was quiet for a moment. Your father came to me once, she said, when you were very young. You were maybe 4 years old. And he said he was proud. He was always proud, but he said I worry that I'm teaching him to hold everything alone, that I'm showing him that strength means not needing anyone. She paused. He said he was afraid you'd grow up believing that the most important things were the things you built by yourself. The parlor was warm around them, the fire in the grate, the sound of 12 people eating and talking and being alive together. He was a little bit right, Margaret said gently, and a little bit wrong, because the things you built alone, they were real and they were good. But you built them from the outside of yourself, Nathaniel, never from the inside. He looked at the fire. Elizabeth Carter, Margaret said, is the first person who ever made you build something from the inside. He had no words for that. He didn't try to find any. Margaret patted his arm and went to join the others. The first dinner they hosted as husband and wife was in March. The table was full. Different from the summer dinners, fewer people performing, more people actually present. Thomas Reach and his wife, the Hargroves, two neighboring families that Nathaniel had always respected and never quite gotten close to, because getting close to people required a kind of opening up he hadn't known how to do. Elizabeth had written the invitations. She had consulted him on the guest list with the same focused attention she brought to account books who belonged, what the evening was for. She had told him very plainly that a dinner table was not a social performance. It was a chance to put the right people in the same room and let them be real together. He had said she sounded like his aunt. She had said she would take that as the compliment it was. She was at his right hand, where she had always been. Where Margaret had placed her 3 summers ago for reasons that had seemed at the time like a small private agenda, and had turned out to be the most significant thing anyone had ever done for him. The table was loud with real conversation. Someone was arguing about the Eastern Road. A county commissioner had finally agreed to fund an assessment of load tolerance, which Thomas Reach mentioned with the slight smile of a man who knew exactly who had put that idea in the right ears. Elizabeth, beside Nathaniel, was talking to Catherine Hargrove about the spring household calendar. She was precise and warm and entirely herself, and Catherine was listening with the full attention of a woman who had spent years being managed by this person and was only now understanding what she'd had. Nathaniel picked up his wine glass. He did not make a speech. He was never going to be the man who made speeches at his own dinner table. But he held his glass for a moment, and he looked at Elizabeth, who was talking, who was alive and real, and here, who had walked into this house in a faded blue dress 3 summers ago, and shown him without trying that everything he thought mattered was decoration around the thing that actually did. She felt him looking. She turned. He raised his glass barely just enough. She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her eyes that was not surprise and not performance, and not the careful composure she'd spent years perfecting. Just her, clear and steady, and finally fully sure. She raised hers back. Years later, when people in Piedmont County told the story, and they told it often because it was the kind of story that improved with each telling, they said it differently depending on who was doing the telling. Some said it was the classic case of a powerful man recognizing quality. Some said the aunt had engineered the whole thing from start to finish. Some, Frederick Dunmore among them, though he said it only rarely and never loudly, said the woman had known exactly what she was doing. None of them were entirely right. What had actually happened was simpler and harder than any of those versions. A woman who had learned to survive alone sat beside a man who had learned to manage alone, and they recognized something in each other that neither of them had been able to name until they were looking straight at it. And a 70-year-old woman who had loved her nephew since he was 4 years old had looked at an August dinner table and understood before either of them did that the right people in the right room could do the rest for themselves. Nathaniel told his children when they were old enough to hear it that the greatest error of his life was believing importance came from what a man built and held and protected from the outside. That he had spent 12 years managing an estate and 0 years managing himself, and that it had taken a woman in a faded blue dress to show him the difference. He told them their mother had kept cleaner books than anyone he'd ever hired, and had seen the Eastern Road problem in August, and waited until January to mention it, and had restructured the Southern accounts in 17 days instead of 3 weeks, and had never once in her life said a word she didn't mean. He told them she was the most honest person he had ever known, and Elizabeth, sitting beside him when he said this, looked at her children with the expression she had worn since that first real smile crossed the dinner table 3 summers before their father ever said a word that mattered, open, clear, certain. She said, "Your father is better at speeches than he admits." And Nathaniel said, "Your mother is better at everything than she admits." And the children who had grown up watching two people build something from the inside out knew they were both exactly right. Margaret Whitmore had died the previous spring, in her 72nd year, in her own bed with the particular piece of a woman who had done what she came to do. She had lived long enough to hold two grandchildren of the spirit Elizabeth's children, Nathaniel's children hers, by love and intention, and to see the dinner table full every season with people who were actually present for each other. She had not left a note. She didn't need to. She had said everything worth saying across 3 summers of dinner parties, 1 preserved BlackBerry package, and a seating arrangement that nobody understood until they did. The wrong woman at the table had always been the only right one. And the woman who placed her there had known it from the very first night. That was the whole truth of it, simple and complete and entirely certain.